Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. Recently, the U.S. military has been bombing boats in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Venezuela. This marks a major escalation and a new development in the U.S.'s hybrid war on Venezuela that has been waged over the last 20 years. In this episode, we speak with Joe Emersberger, who, along with Justin Podour, authored the book Extraordinary Threat: The U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela for Monthly Review Press. We talk about the origin of this tactic of aerial assassinations, its deployment in international waters, and whether we could see the U.S. expand its assassination programs to target government leaders like Nicolas Maduro, as we have seen the so-called State of Israel do with full U.S. backing. We also discuss the merging of war on drugs policies and the policies of the war on terror and contextualize these so-called wars. Finally, we talk about some of the dynamics that hem in progressive and socialistic projects in Latin America, using Joe's long engagement with Ecuador as an example. Joe Emersberger is based in Canada. He is co-author of Extraordinary Threat: The U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. His work can be found on his Substack, Unedited Anti-Imperialism. Older articles of his can be found on Venezuelanalysis, Counterpunch, Fair.org, ZNet, and Mint Press News. As always, if you like the work that we do, the best way to support the show is to become a patron of the show at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism, or through either an ongoing pledge or one-time donation through Buy Me a Coffee. Now, here's our conversation with Joe Emersberger. All right, so Joe Emersberger, it's good to be with you. It's nice to finally have you on the show. We're both tanky therapists. I don't feel like a therapist. I feel more like a recipient of the therapy, but glad to be in that group of folks with you and looking forward to this conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about Venezuela, a little bit about just a couple different, Latin America, South America, and its relation to the U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism. Obviously, there's this situation we've been following. We did one podcast on it already. And, kind of important, I think, to keep monitoring it and talking about it is the situation with the U.S. military in the Caribbean Sea, off the coast of Venezuela. And, now we have a second assassination on a boat. So even if some people thought that the first one was AI or something like that, I think people understand by now that this is really something that's happening. And of course, we're being told that these people are, by the U.S. government is describing them as narco-terrorists, which, I mean, I have issues with even that term, even the idea that there's something about, the flow of narcotics that connects somebody into terrorism. I mean, probably the best proxies of that we have of historically would be like the U.S. military or the CIA. But, that's the term, right, that the State Department of Justice are kind of using. And, as you highlighted in the piece you co-authored, there's no due process here for folks. Like, these are extrajudicial assassinations. And they're either happening, I don't know whether by drone or by, airstrike. But before we get into kind of directly discussing Venezuela, which I do want to talk about because I think it's very important context to always talk about, but I'm wondering if you might take a little time to talk about, how we get here from your vantage point on a tactical level, like how we get to a place where this idea of bombing boats, or bombing people in countries as an execution strategy without any form of due process or any, trial or anything like that. And so I know we have multiple precedents that we can talk to about this, as well as current things that are going on in the world. But, how do, in your view, has this become kind of a normalized thing, which obviously it shouldn't be, but, here we are.
Yeah, it dates back to the war on terror, really. George W. Bush's war on terror, where they kind of normalized the idea they can go all over the world and kidnap whoever they want, take them to black sites or to Guantanamo or something like that. And then Obama expanded that with this drone warfare where he's doing all these extrajudicial executions all over West Asia. So I see Trump as just bringing that tech. And now we see, oh, we can do that in the Americas in our own backyard. Um, I mean, in some ways they've done it before. Like they bombed Panama in 1990 to kidnap Manuel Noriega and killed like thousands of people in the process. But it wasn't the regular. With the war on terror with Obama. Since then, they've just increasingly normalized it. Like I'm now up to 3 different boats, that drug boats, whatever, that Trump alleges that he's blown out of the water. Yeah, so he's normalized this, and it's expanding from the policies that they've used in West Asia and for decades now, since the war on terror. So that's how I see it. It's just as kind of a constant escalation that's going on and spreading further and getting more brazen and outrageous, because there's not even a claim that, I mean, I guess you said talked about the term narco-terrorism. I mean, illegal drugs and addiction and all those things are lethal in the United States. So they probably say, oh, because it's lethal, therefore people who are smuggling drugs in are therefore terrorists. They're terrorizing us with this illegal drug problem, with this addiction problem. It's legal drugs and illegal drugs that's a major problem in the United States. Obviously it's also hundreds of billions of dollars a year that goes into banks, and that, I mean, once the drugs gets to the United States, it gets moved internally. I mean, obviously there's if they were serious about dealing with the problem, there's lots of stuff they could do besides just murder people at sea. But yeah, I see that's as just an evolution from things that go way back to probably the most relevant is probably George W. Bush with the war on terror.
Yeah. I mean, I think to the drug trafficking thing, I mean, I've been reading Seth Harp's new book, which is called The Fort Bragg Cartel, and like it's a really well-written book, and he talks about both I mean, obviously, and I know you've talked about this as well, and you talk about it a little bit in the piece too. Like, we have the history in Afghanistan where there basically were no drugs in Afghanistan, prior to the war on terror because the Taliban had basically eradicated the growth of opium and things like that. And I mean, in that book, it's really fascinating because what he's dealing with is actually that a lot of special forces community in the United States is involved in still like currently, and he uses current cases, current murders, as well as like drug cases and a lot of good reporting to document like the flow of narcotics from Afghanistan, but also like other places within the war on terror that are in like Tajikistan. He talks about like places where special forces, particularly like Delta Force, but other groups too, had a big presence. And, as their presence showed up, suddenly, large scale drug operations started, coming to be. And a lot of these folks, I mean, there's a two-sided thing that he's talking about. One is that people get addicted, right? So like the soldiers actually develop addictions because the kind of adrenaline that they get in military combat can only really be replicated through the use of narcotics, basically. And so then a lot of the initial flow of drugs is like among them, but then because they have access and because really police and district attorneys and judges don't like to prosecute or lock up US, military, especially active duty folks. And so they're getting out of cases. And anyway, it's an interesting book, but I think it's one of those things of like what you're saying is that, there's a lot that the United States would have to tackle in terms of this huge industry if the purpose was really to end the flow of drugs into the United States. Obviously, also its own healthcare system, right? The access of healthcare for a lot of people as well. So, yeah. Anyway, it's all important, I think, to understand and to kind of another thing you point out in your piece, which I think is important too, is that a lot of the narcotics that do, the drugs that do flow up from Latin America flow up from, I guess, the western side, the Pacific corridor, from South America, rather than particularly from Venezuela. But it's convenient for them to use this designation. It's kind of the latest designation that they use to go after Maduro.
Yeah, I think one thing that's appealing to them is just this off the books way to fund their covert ops and everything too. Because It's significant money. It's not. It's huge. Like it's could be the third largest industry, domestic industry in the United States. This illegal drugs. So it's a significant source. It's hundreds of billions of dollars. That's not insignificant money for the CIA for any they want to fund. They want to do in bribes. They want to do covert ops. They want to illegally transfer arms. That's a lot of dough that can fund that stuff where you don't have to worry about Congress or and you get in with these guys and you have it's like with as far back as Castro, you get in with the mafia, you use them for your assassination attempts, and then at the same time you do this grandstanding like you're going after them to shut them down. So it creates it's kind of a dysfunction, but within the system, right? Because then that can blow back on them. Yeah, it's a very dangerous problem. But it has so many uses for so many things that's why it's a war that's never won. You have to go back all the way to Nixon. Nixon talked about a war on terror like in 1971, when I was just like 5 years old.
Wow. That's interesting. I didn't even know that he used that term. But yeah. Yeah. So you and Justin Podour wrote a book that was really kind of looked at the history of a lot of the U.S. efforts to overthrow the Venezuelan government over the last couple of decades. Do you want to kind of walk folks through, remind people some of that history and the various methods or approaches that the U.S. has used to undermine Venezuelan sovereignty? And I mean, we could deal with this either as part of that question or separately, but the U.S. media plays a role, which is something you all talk about. And then there's tactics of institutions like the Department of Justice and the State Department and that sort of stuff as well.
Sure. Yeah. So Hugo Chavez was first elected in 1998. And so his political movement, they referred to as Chavismo, it's still in power today. But by 2001, he was elected in 98, he takes office in 99. But by 2001, the United States has already decided that this guy has to go. It seems that one of the key breaking points was when he condemned the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. So there was a major falling out. And so what Justin and I talk about is the propaganda against Chavismo that basically took place from that period, from 2001 till 2021, when we published the book. We pretty much went that whole period. We covered all the propaganda, not just from the Western media, but from big like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, Committee to Protect, all the big NGOs, as well as the U.S. government, Western media. So we covered all of it, and we looked at what they were saying about Chavismo for those 2 decades. And interestingly, what you won't find in our book is very much mention about drugs or about Venezuela being a drug, because that was just not a significant part of the propaganda at all for decades. It just wasn't about that. I mean, not that you couldn't go to some right-wing sources here and there and find the allegations. You could, but it was not any significant part of their propaganda. It was all about claiming that Hugo Chavez was becoming dictatorial, and then that Maduro was a dictator, because Chavez died in 2013. He endorsed Nicolas Maduro to be president, and people voted him. He won the election, and so on. Anyway, so for 2 decades, the whole attack line on Venezuela was that it was becoming a dictatorship, that it was corrupt, that it was incompetent, the people were suffering, and we have to help them, and that was the line for 2 decades. So this new line about drugs, that didn't happen until Trump changed the narrative, the propaganda attack, like in 2020. All of a sudden, he issued an indictment accusing Maduro of trying to flood the United States with cocaine. So that was 2020 when that first took off. So for decades, that was not any significant part of the propaganda. So what Justin and I cover is we break down basically 6 different U.S.-backed attempts to overthrow Chavez. The first one happened in 2002, and in a way, it's kind of almost, you could almost say, the most important or most significant one, because it actually succeeded for 2 days. For 2 days, Hugo Chavez was kidnapped. He was being held hostage, and some military men had basically appointed a business leader as Pedro Carmona as the new head of government, and they were in power for 2 days. And in this 2-day period, the United States immediately, the State Department comes out recognizing Carmona's government as legitimate. The IMF, like, these guys were only out, like, literally, you could also say 47 hours, not even the IMF, which is basically U.S. run, especially when it comes to the Americas, immediately came out to tell the Carmona's government, hey, you need money, we're here for you, And so they came up publicly with that statement, like, immediately. But and not only that, but the New York Times immediately wrote an editorial applauding the coup, saying they had rescued Venezuela's democracy, had been rescued. They said, yeah, it doesn't look great, but this is actually a good thing, and they're praising Pedro Carmona as a respected business. So the New York Times came up, and if we also look at like if you look at Amnesty International, they basically hid under the desk, didn't say much, and shortly afterwards they were basically bad mouthing Chavez in their reports and stuff. Human Rights Watch didn't do the most basic stuff they could do, like demand that the government be reinstated. So across the board, the whole system, the whole Western system, the U.S. government and all its enablers, all the human rights reporters without borders, everybody, they were all basically on board with the coup. And then it was reversed. And so they got caught basically with their pants down because they all gone all in supporting the coup. And that's kind of haunted them ever since. At least with the Chavista base, they understand who their enemies are because they are thoroughly exposed. So that's what I say. That's one of the most important, arguably the most important coup, because it really exposed everybody. So several months later, there was an attempt by the U.S.-backed opposition to shut down the oil industry. It caused like a 20-point contraction in GDP. It was just absolutely incredible what they did. It was basically a management-led lockout. So that happened. And then there in 2014, then in 2017, there were major street protests, very violent, killing people, killing bystanders. And so the government's put in a position where if you actually use police violence to put down the violent protesters, then you're accused of violating human rights. And hopefully that could entice the military to then have a pretext to say, oh, we can't allow these human rights. That was the intent, to hopefully get like they did in 2002, get a segment of the military to step in and take over. But it didn't work. Then in 2019, there was one of the coup attempts was basically Trump recognizing this guy, character Juan Guaido, as president of the United States. That then became a legal pretext for a full U.S. Oil embargo on Venezuela. And prior to that, I should mention in 2015, Obama actually declared Venezuela to be an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. But interestingly, when he did that, the original reaction of the media was, well, that's just a formality. The New York Times actually reported it that way. It's just a formality. It's just the legal language he has to use. We know Venezuela is not a threat because, again, the drug thing, they're flooding us with drugs. That was no part of the propaganda, no significant part of the propaganda. So, but then by 2020, Trump's telling us, no, Venezuela is a threat, right? Venezuela is a threat to us. They're flooding us with cocaine. And now he's blowing up boats in the Caribbean on this ludicrous pretext that he's protecting you from cocaine, from Venezuelan cocaine. So that's where we've come to. It's evolved over all these decades. But there was a shift in 2020 with the drug thing. Now that's become a key part of the propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing we should say, touching on this, is kind of like, I know you've also talked about the history of the sanctions and like the impact that those have had on the country, on the people of Venezuela. I mean, obviously the oil thing is also an issue, like with Guaido, I think is part of how they ended up with like forcing Venezuela into selling Citgo, right? Like, isn't that like connected somehow? Because they took some state assets, I think, and gave them to Guaido, something like that.
Guaido, by recognizing Guaido, they said, oh, these assets, they aren't your assets. They're Guaido's assets. They're really, the Venezuelan government under Maduro to them doesn't exist. The only government that exists is Juan Guaido's fantasy government. So the assets, Venezuelan assets that are in the United States, they actually belong to Guaido's official government, which, just became an excuse to steal. And that it did with the embassy. They actually took over the embassy, which was, in legal terms, quite a big deal. I mean, how much? I mean, where in the world has anyone dared to take over a U.S. embassy and say, sorry, this ain't yours, this ain't Trump's, so we're going to recognize, some random person in the U.S. It's actually his government. We're taking over your assets here in the country. So they took over the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. Yeah, so that was a key intensification of the sanctions. But Obama got the ball rolling because his executive order declaring Venezuela an extraordinary, that has to get renewed every year. So that's been renewed every year by Biden and by Trump, right? And what Trump did in 2017 was he made a major escalation also by basically outlying Venezuela from being able to access U.S. financial markets, because unfortunately, people aren't often aware how large and how influential U.S. financial markets remain. Even though, yes, the U.S. empire is declining in relative terms, but still, like let's say Ecuador does trade with Argentina. the money transfer between those two inevitably ends up going through U.S. banks somehow. The whole payment system is set up that way, right? And there hasn't been now people talk about BRICS and other countries developing alternatives. It's in the works, but the United States remains a huge thorn in the side of the whole world in terms of their ability to just do payments. And so that gave them tremendous leverage. So when Trump did that, that really was a major blow to Venezuela's oil industry, to its entire economy. When he basically outlawed any kind of dealings with Venezuela in the U.S. financial system, and then they expanded that to be even second to so-called secondary sanctions, where they're not only going after anyone who deals with Venezuela directly, but people would deal with them indirectly, and try to, and so it really, and then it intensified yet again with the recognition of Guaido, because then and the thing about that is that even hurt the United States to a point, because a lot of refineries in the United States were only able to process really Venezuelan oil. It's not cheap for them to transfer over to anything else. But I think the calculation was clearly that Venezuela would collapse quickly after that happened, and it didn't. Similar kind of to what happened with Iran in 1979, where for a period of time, the sanctions are extremely devastating and they remain harmful. But it's also true that if you can survive them, you find other alliances, you find other workarounds, and you can kind of stabilize the situation. The situation in Venezuela right now is not anything like it was, like, say, in 2018 or 2019. It's definitely improved since then, although not to as much as we'd hope, but it has. So I think that's another reason why perhaps Trump feels he has to up the ante now, because the sanctions are kind of like, well, you've kind of hit them with everything you can really hit them with. So now we gotta find another way to intensify things.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I did a podcast with Sierra Pascual Marquina and Chris Gilbert a couple months ago. Then they did their special issue of Monthly Review on communes and Venezuela. And I've talked to them a few times over the years, and they really said, like, the economy is in a much better place. They said, look, it's a recovery on capitalist terms, but like it's definitely a recovery, and people, they're not in the same issues of hyperinflation and money not being able to buy things and all this kind of stuff that they were dealing with in 2018 through 2020 or so, and things have improved. And that makes sense to me why you might see, as you say, like this shift now to this new line of tactics, which I think are incredibly dangerous. I mean, as you talk about in the piece, like, all the elements are there, for a decapitation strike, that we could actually see the US government, actually use a drone or an airstrike or something like that to try to, attack Miraflores or wherever they think that Maduro is at this time. And I mean, it's a wild thing to talk about and to think about it, but I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think it is a real threat in this world now, particularly with all of the things that, the US has supported Israel in doing over the last couple of years, all of the assassinations of, whether it's Iranian government officials or Yemeni government officials, not to mention, of course, all the like civil officials within Gaza, that have been killed alongside obviously tons and tons of civilians. But it obviously also, for the United States, I mean, I can't think of something quite like this that we've seen before. So it would also be an escalation in terms of how the United States is dealing with countries that it deems, adversaries and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, what are your reflections or your thoughts on this right now?
Well, that's, logically, I see no reason. Logically, I see no reason why the tactics from West Asia. Why wouldn't you apply them to the Americas? I just don't see any reason why they wouldn't. It's like, hey, we've gotten away with it over here on such a large scale so many times. Why wouldn't they apply it here? I mean, we kind of have, we don't really, it's all like, yeah, forever, United States has been sponsoring coups and even doing outright invasions. But this would be something different. The closest thing I could think of is Noriega's kidnapping, or they openly kidnapped Noriega. But I think if they're capable now of just bringing what they're doing to West Asia to the Americas, you can see it just with the blowing up these boats. I mean, this is like his the gateway drug, so to speak. Like, just it's getting people, softening people up to the idea that to the end. It's is horrifying. Like I said, logically, that's why we wrote the piece, just looking at it logically. But emotionally, I still find it hard. I can't accept it. Like emotionally, you just don't want. I it's very hard for me to accept that this could happen. But I just I can't believe it. Like on that level, I can't believe it. I can't. I just something tells me, no, come on, they can't do that. They can't be bombing, like you say, bomb Miraflores, assassinate Maduro, assassinate his top generals or whoever. But logically, I'm saying, well, what restrains them? What are the costs? What costs have they paid for everything they've done the last 2 years? What have they suffered? Is Blinken up at night worrying he's going to get arrested? I don't think so. I don't see no reason. I wish he were tormented by the fear of, you know, being hauled before a tribunal or something. But I don't think these guys have any fear. I think they have less fear now than they did even 2 years ago, and that's horrifying. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get it, and I have the same probably 2 kind of, ways of looking at it as sort of like trying to put on my analyst hat, it's just like, well, yeah, what stops them from doing this? Clearly, they want to do it. They would have loved to have been able to do this for a long time, and, you know, I think they probably thought that they couldn't get away with certain things, 2 years ago or whatever, and as they've watched what Israel has been able to get away with and what they've been able to get away with in terms of continuing to provide all of this support to Israel as it's doing all these things and not seeing any consequence for it for themselves. It's quite scary, and it reminds me. I had a conversation. Have a lot of conversations with this Palestinian intellectual Abdul Jawad Omar, and he talks about how for him, the way he thinks about Israel in this moment is in this declining empire, in this declining, if we think about the core, right, within the world system and kind of Western Europe and the United States and Israel as this, client, in West Asia, that Israel is the one that's like, we'll show you guys the way. Like as things get worse, like this is what you do. You more hard power, more brutality, and that by them doing that and getting away with it essentially for the last couple of years. And I don't want to undermine it. It's not like there's been no consequences, I think, to Israel long term. I think Israel, hopefully we will see the consequences of this play out, not as fast as we would like, of course, but we will see them. But within that kind of brain of this, these declining imperial states, I think there is something about the kind of boldness and just, saying, "Hey, like it's not about doing USAID, USAID anymore. We're not doing that anymore. We're doing drone strikes. We're beating people into submission." And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there is a big emotional part of me that doesn't want that to be the case. It wants the world to unite against the imperial core and show a different way, but we haven't seen that yet, really.
Yeah, well, we've seen Israel take major hits, um, but not even remotely close to what they deserve. Not even, then that's the problem, because we know that's okay. It's not even close to what they did. They don't deserve to exist. I mean, these guys should not even be on Earth. They should be gone. The whole Israel should be not exist. That's what we want to get to, because we know that's what they deserve. But it's not even close to where we're at. I should say not even close, but it's not. We're not close, not nearly close enough. The time scale we're operating on just doesn't help while we're watching a genocide every day. So yeah, so you look at those things, and then it's like, how can you, like you say, with the logical part of your brain, you look at that and say, wow, this is dangerous. Like they could do something. Maybe one of the restraining factors still is maybe just fear of mass migration, although they already have mass migration. So I'm not even sure about that. I'm not even sure they really fear that, because it seems like a lot of times with right wing governments, the problems they create then just become fuel for them to double down and just do more of the same. If crime goes up, great. you know, we'll be more harsh. We'll be, more incarceration, more power to the cops, that kind of deal. So yeah, so it's there's no question. It's a dilemma, because you don't want to see it, but it's if you look at it with put your emotions aside, look at it. Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah. So, I mean, changing gears a little bit, and we can come back to some of this too if we want to, but you and I have exchanged a little bit of discussion, around the situation in Bolivia, which I don't follow as closely as I should. And, there was a piece I sent you and you wrote back, I thought some great notes on it and appreciated your insights. But I know for you, like, you have a lot more familiarity with the situation in Ecuador, and I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about that so that we could kind of talk about some of the insights that you've drawn from that experience in terms of some of the dynamics that you see in countries in Latin America, global South countries, particularly as they have, progressive or socialistic projects and just some of the contradictions that they have to deal with. And maybe you could say a little bit, just talk a little bit about the Correa years in Ecuador, as well as some of the dynamics after he left power and, how you kind of read similar dynamics maybe in either the Bolivian context or just, more broadly.
Yeah, so Correa was first elected in 2006. He was part of the Pink Tide, where left wing governments were elected in Brazil and well, they already existed in Venezuela, but then they also existed in Bolivia and Argentina. So there was a quite a wave of progressive governments and even Uruguay, but different in different ways, left to the in a broad sense, like some much more left than others. I mean, but Correa was one of the more left ones because Rafael Correa actually joined ALBA. He became a big supporter of Hugo Chavez. He remains like he just recently did a very, very nice, respectful interview with Nicolas Maduro. In Ecuador, he's totally vilified. Even people within Correa's own party right now in Ecuador don't want to be supportive, but they don't want to. They want to basically run and hide from the Venezuela issue, right? Because it's been so weaponized against them. And part of that's because there's been a lot of migration during the worst years of the crisis in Venezuela. A lot of migration to Ecuador, a lot of throughout the Americas, right? And so that becomes a tool for the right wing to say, look at that, those socialist governments, they create this migration that takes your jobs away, blah blah, the whole spiel. But anyways, Correa came to office in 2006, or sorry, elected 2006, takes office 2007, and he's in office till 2017. So yeah, he did a lot of great things while he was in office. Poverty fell by like 40%. There was massive improvements in the infrastructure of the country, and I traveled there a lot, and so I just places that where before used to take 8 hours to get to now take 3 hours to drive to because the roads are well maintained and new and everything. And crime was gradually increasing for decades, and he brought it down by 2/3. All sorts of changes to the judicial system. Ecuador became, by 2017, by the time he left office, he was like the second most safe country in the hemisphere in Latin America. And I can testify just myself. I traveled all over the country by car with my family during his years, and you never had any fear of being mugged or anything. It was very safe. And it was one of the favorite spots for actually U.S. retirees. It became one to go because it was safe. It's very beautiful. So people like to go there from the U.S. They retire. They want a place where tends to be cheaper. And so, anyways, he did a lot of great things. But in 2017, he hands power over to, he endorses one of his former vice presidents. And within weeks of taking office, he turns completely, this guy, Lenny Moreno, he turns completely against Correa and just becomes like a caricature of a right-wing government. He's such a fraud. It's almost funny how cynically he turned around. And he does and the right wing in Ecuador just couldn't believe their luck. I said, oh my God, this guy's perfect. Because you have a guy within Correa's party himself who just destroyed everything. They fired the Constitutional Court, replaced it. They fired all kinds of judges, got rid of judges and prosecute, just restacked the whole judicial system. So bottom line, right now, Correa left office. He didn't actually flee Ecuador. He left office and he went to Belgium because his wife is from Belgium, and he's living in Belgium. And suddenly he has to defend himself against all these lawsuits they launch against him. And they were crazy and the crazy lawsuits. And he actually in Belgium ends up giving him political asylum because it was so obvious it was just political persecution. So now he's in Belgium actually with political asylum. And he's remained active, like he's trying to help his party get back into office, but he can't run. He's banned from running. He's a sentenced criminal as far as the Ecuadorian authorities are concerned. So they've tried to get back into office a few times in a few recent presidential elections. They've lost, very close, This last election, though, are widely believed to be fraudulent, widely believed to have been stolen. But yeah, progressively under these, like I said, under Correa, Ecuador became the second most safe country in Latin America. Right now, it's the most dangerous. Its homicide rate went from, like, when Correa left office, just under 6 deaths per homicide deaths per 100,000. Now it's to over 40. It's just gone haywire, and Ecuador's become a major hub for drug trafficking. That has a lot to do with the violence. It's a lot of drug lords. Just they've taken over the prisons, and it's just become a total nightmare. Um, and of course, and yeah, with all the persecution and everything else that goes with it, political persecution, and it's just a mess. But I guess if you could go back and criticize Correa, I think one of the bad calls he made was believing that he could just walk away and appoint a successor, even for a short period of time. He obviously didn't trust. He trusted not just, there's a lot of people he trusted who he shouldn't have trusted. Uh, but if you look at Chavismo, it's had the same problem. But with the good thing is they've had Maduro in office, and even as people have betrayed the movement. Even Castro had people betray the movement. There are always people who betray a left wing government because it's in a capitalist run world. There's always people you can buy off and get the flip, right? But they've managed to keep control of the state, whereas Correa basically handed control of the state to one of the traitors. So that was the issue there. But I guess the broader issue is that when you play by the rules of democracy under the imperial boot, it's always an issue. It seems like it's happened in Ecuador, it's happened in Bolivia, it's happened in Argentina, where in Brazil, to a point where progressive governments can do good things, make improvements, but then if you play by these rules, eventually with the media, with the empire, with everything that's working against you, it tends to get undone. And so if you look at Cuba, where they didn't play by those rules, where Castro said very explicitly, no, we do not have, the imperialists will not be, they do not have right to free expression. They do not have a right to political parties. They've actually, despite all the hardships, despite all the problems, they've in so many ways are better off. I mean, in certain important metrics like child mortality, way better off than most of Latin America. No, I'd say all of Latin America. So there's a lesson there. There's no easy path. Like, I'm not saying these governments could easily have chosen Cuba's way. I'm just making the observation. I don't know if Correa had tried to go Cuba's way, or Chavez, and just say screw liberal democracy, we're doing it Castro's way. It might not have worked out for them. Maybe it would have resulted in them being overthrown or something. I don't know. I can't predict, but I'm just making the observation that you look at Cuba and the way they went. It you can make a lot of arguments for saying, well, what they did actually was better. It worked out better.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it's one of those things. It's like, I mean, an election represents, I mean, we have the most grotesque version of it in the United States, where elections are, a multi-billion dollar thing, it's like a game show almost, right? With like big capital just dumping money into it. But, obviously around the world, they don't have to spend that kind of money, but they dump money in. They figure out ways to, like you said, I mean, you can get, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things within the Latin American context, and Lenin Moreno, I think, is a good example of this, is that you can have somebody who comes through a party. I mean, it's part of the question with Bolivia to some extent too, I think, is like you can have somebody who's a part of the party who seems like a good successor, and then, like, it becomes difficult to sometimes for people to tell, well, like, oh, has the party gone bad? Is it just this person? Like, suddenly we have these neoliberal policies, but they're coming from a supposedly, left-wing candidate or whatever. And of course, like you say, there's all these incentives. I mean, it's ironic that it's often the more left-leaning people who get charged with corruption, right? The ones who actually are improving the quality of life for working class people who get charged with corruption so often, but not the people who are probably really very corrupt. So yeah, I don't know if you have more you want to say on that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, corruption's ever any government has corruption. It's the question is, does it interfere with policy? Is it preventing them from making gains, from transferring resources to the people? Right, that's the question. I'm not that corruption's good or anything, but it's very difficult to deal with because it's always present. So it can always be, no matter how, even if you deal with it well. Like I think Korea dealt with it very well overall. Just having gone there, the quality of public services, everything, the efficiency, the even the dignity with which they treated people, the giving people dignity when they just go for a license for a marriage license or a birth certificate or something. Just the way they treated you dramatically improved under Korea. But all sorts of things. But there's always going to be some level of corruption. I mean, you can't. It doesn't become a utopia overnight. So there's always something you can weaponize. It's always contradictions there, right? So yeah, and the other thing is that you can't always, even if you like with elections, like if you hold on to a good leader, but still nobody lives forever. So you can't. You're going to have to eventually deal with the whole issue of, okay, who are you going to trust now? Even if you think this guy's good, but you're going to have to eventually you're going to have to hand off to somebody else. So it's a dilemma, right? That all people face. Cuba managed to face it well. Venezuela faced it well. I mean, I think Maduro turned out to be a very good choice. I don't know if Chavez got lucky or was good, whatever it may be, but he got somebody who actually fights for the project and is willing to do whatever it takes to keep the project going and not bow to imperialism. So that's a very good thing. But that doesn't always happen. And even within Chavismo, like I said, there have been very high profile people you would never have dreamed. And we mentioned him in Justin and I mentioned in the book, people you never would have dreamed. They were more Chavista than Chavez, like so on the survey, you think this guy's never going to betray the pride. And they did totally. So it's very hard to say, because sometimes opportunists, you can spot them a mile off, but not always. I mean, anybody can be fooled, if somebody wants to, like Lenny Moreno put on a great act. Nobody would have guessed. He was praising Correa to the sky, even during the campaign. Nobody would have guessed beforehand that he would have turned like he did. So yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem that plagues every project that's anti-capitalist has that. Because with the capitalist project, like if you look at Ecuador, they've had 3 different presidents now. And there's no problem. If Noboa, he already had to steal the election, and his popularity is already going down. He's facing massive protests because all the stuff he's doing. It's a matter of time before he becomes such a reviled figure that he has to give up. But they'll just replace him with somebody else. A guy like that is a dime a dozen. They'll find some other rich kid. They've already found he's a third president to keep their project. Doesn't require lead. That's why Mexico for a long time under Neil could have term limits. Would just replace them every time. It doesn't matter. You don't need a good leader to keep that kind of project going. You already have an oligarchic project that sustains itself. Same with the United States. Who needs term limits to keep capitalism going? You take Trump, you put somebody else in, right? I mean, it just keeps going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the things, I did want to pick your brain about a little bit too is you live in the same media sphere that I do here in the United States, or in the global North. And when I say Western Marxism, and when I talk about, the concern I have, right, is a kind of idealism, right, or an idea that you're going to resolve all of the contradictions at once, or that things are going to be, our wildest dreams are going to come into being because we elect a socialist or something like that. And things just don't work like that. Especially, I mean, in general, they don't work like that. But in global South countries, there's all types of added pressures that these states have to deal with in terms of navigating their role, often as mono producers, or countries that are maybe their economy is based largely on oil or extraction or these kind of things. There's all kinds of things that they have to deal with. And, there's a lot of people, I think, in the Western left looking down, think that they're fighting for a more left wing project. And maybe that, I think those dynamics also exist on the ground in these countries too, right? Of people who may be more radical in their ideas, right, than what they see enacted in practice by some of these governments. But I'm interested in, like, how you see the dynamics of that playing out in those circumstances. Particularly, you talked a little bit to me, like, offline about, people who work for, say, nonprofits or in the academic sphere in these spaces, and how there can be kind of a disconnect between those folks and the government, some of the problems that can cause.
Yeah, sure. Well, one big thing that's been weaponized is this whole idea of extractivism, uh, because, like you say, a country like Ecuador or Bolivia, they're not advanced economies. They don't have but compared to Canada, he has much in the way of manufacturing or products that they actually sell. They're not value added. They tend to export raw materials and import finished products, right, from elsewhere. And getting out of that is very difficult. But it becomes like, for the knocks on Korea are so contradictory because they say, well, you never really transformed. You just redistributed the oil money. That's all you did, or redistributed, because Ecuador isn't as dependent on oil as Venezuela. It's also exports bananas and shrimp and other stuff, right? Its economy is more balanced that way, but it's still basically exporting stuff and getting back, the manufactured items or processed items, whatever. So people would kind of go at them from both ends. Say, how come you're not eliminating extractivism, but then also how come you're not developing? Well, how do you do both? Well, you need income to develop. You need resources. You need to uh, fund uh, manufacturing, or that kind of development. If you look at how the countries that are today the imperial core, how did they develop? Well, the United States especially, they tariff the fuck out of everybody else. They bailed up their infant industries. Of course, expropriate massive amounts of land from the regional inhabitants and commit genocide and all that stuff too. But on top of that, protect the hell out of their industries until they're at a point where now when you feel they can compete, then you say, okay, let's be free traders. So, but that process is not going to happen. Ecuador is not going to, take over other parts of the world, or be able to bully other countries to get what it wants. It has to play by its rules. So it has to export items and then try to use that to develop. So what they would attack Korea with is say that, well, you're not getting rid of the oil. How come you're not getting rid of the oil extraction? Or and at the same time accusing them of not developing or not. So it's you need money. And how do you resolve the contradiction? Well, actually, Korea came up with a good idea. He said, okay, look, you guys don't want us to, you guys, and especially in the global north, or environmentalists here in our own country, are up our ass telling us, don't extract. Oh, it's okay. Look, go to the rich countries who've been basically extracting wealth from us for centuries, and tell them, okay, pay us an income to not do it. Basically, pay us to not do it. Then let us bypass it by supplying us the money, and he had set up a fund, and this was specifically to not drill in a piece of a national park, right? And he said, okay, we'll set up a fund. You guys donate it to it and see how much you collect, and tried to promote it. And they basically got nothing because the so-called even if they were sincere, the environmentalists in other countries, they don't have the clout, the political clout, to actually get money for them, right? To support that kind of project, right? But what bothers me is if you don't have that kind of clout to get people the money to bypass extractivism in countries like Ecuador, then you also shouldn't be shitting on the governments for doing extractivism. You should be owning up to the fact that, hey, this is kind of our problem, where we need to find ways to, if you want countries to bypass extractivism to save the climate or whatever, then we have to have economic justice on a global scale, not just shit on the governments and saying, well, don't do extractivism. That doesn't solve it. Them not doing it's not going to help them. It's going to make them poorer. If you want them to bypass it, then get your own governments, your own corporations, and your own countries to pay up. And but so he came then, but that isn't done. So that's what bothers me about this, because it's when you have these ideals or these ideas that might be good, like bypass extractive. Okay, fine, but how do you do it? And who are you pressuring? If all your pressure's on Korea, then I think you're just, knowingly or not, you're just being a tool of the Western imperialism. If you're doing it in a way that says, no, we got to pressure our own governments for equity, on a global scale, then I think that's a positive thing. But it's when it's just an excuse to vilify governments like Korea's or Evo Morales or whoever else, then I think it becomes a reactionary thing. Then I start questioning whether they're actually even sincere in what they're saying, and I start whether this is just an excuse to just, from a left-wing perspective, kind of dress up reactionary ideas, imperialist ideas, and kind of dress them up in a left-wing garb, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real problem. I mean, in some ways, it reflects the issue we dealt with at the beginning of this, which is sort of the flow of drugs. It's like the demand for
Right.
oil or for these things is in the global north, right? The demand for drugs is also in the global north, right? And the policies that the global north are taking to deal with these issues are not dealing with the root cause, of these problems. And so, for if we're talking about oil, I mean, yeah, I mean, Evo Morales also, proposed the climate debt and this sort of thing, and understanding that if you want also, yeah, countries in the global south to move, to change, then you have to actually fund their ability also for them to have clean energy and things like that. But also, as you're saying, like, where are they going to get the GDP? Where are they going to get the actual money that they need to be able to run their societies without this thing that you are paying top dollar for them from? So yeah, I mean, I think it's really, we've had a few conversations over the years with Max Isle, on his stuff around climate in particular. And, he's a big proponent of that and just saying, hey, look at popular demands from the global south around these issues. Understand that any vision of climate justice or an idea of stopping climate change, it has to deal with, the development of global south countries, the reliance that they have had on these income flows, and as well as like what clean energies are they going to have also to be able to continue to support their people and their countries. And so, yeah, I mean, it unfortunately it makes a lot of sense, but capitalism is it's such a fucked up system that way.
Another thing, that another angle to attack this from is the whole issue intellectual property, patents and copyrights, because that's a tremendous cost that the global South has to bear. We saw that during the pandemic, right? And even then, how reluctant the global North is to even consider suspending those so-called rights, those patent rights, and those because that's a basically a huge extortion, really, of money from everybody else. They just say you have to respect these corporate rights, right? So that's another way. That's another way that you could massively improve equity, is by rewriting the rules around intellectual property around the world, right? So that people aren't penalized for developing their own drugs, or buying somebody else's drugs where cheaper and so on, because they have to contend with these investment tribunals, where they come after you, for, or sometimes even just for having environmental regulations. I mean, that's one of the things that Korea fought hard, and Evo Morales and all the other left governments, is get them out of these stupid fucking asinine investment tribunals, where they try to do the most basic common sense stuff in the corporate, and they come after you like crazy in these courts, and try to basically sanction you for doing the most basic things that you should be doing as a country, as a government, for your own people. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways that if you're interested in climate justice or anything like that, that you could go after it from your own countries in a way that isn't, like I say, just vilifying a left wing government like Korea's or Evo Morales is. Yeah. So yeah, there's lots that could be done that way, and when people don't approach it that way, again, I start to question whether they're sincere, whether they're sincere in what they're saying. But and also, like Justin says, at the moment we can't stop a genocide. So it's like the climate thing for me is kind of, it's really gone down the list of things I worry about.
I agree with you. I mean, obviously, it is a sort of existential, issue at this time, but it's hard when we are where we are and we don't, we can't see that, like you said, like Justin said too, yeah, that not being able to stop a genocide, it's hard to sort of set your sights on even bigger political demands than that right now.
Yeah, you're trying to think about how you can fly when you can't even walk. It just, yeah, it's definitely something I think about.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know. Is there anything else you wanted to get to? I have another question about kind of where you get some of your, some of the media that you check out for South America and Latin America. But is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you wanted to hit on?
Covered a lot. Media, Orinoco Tribune is a good source. They have a lot not just on Venezuela, but on Latin America in general. The other one that I would read is read a lot of is Venezuelanalysis. If you want to stay current on, they're excellent. They're excellent English language source. They're based in Venezuela. They're excellent. You've taught, some of them. Um, yeah, so those are sourced for Venezuela and Latin America related things. Yeah, one book I highly recommend people read is Philip Agee's book, Inside the Company, because he was based in Ecuador, and a lot of his stories are from Ecuador, from his time in Ecuador, and uh, that's when he first started to. It's really insightful. It's really insightful. Yeah, I have the exact book here. It's really insightful. And there's a statement in the book. He says basically for 50 grand a year, with a budget of 50 grand a year at that time, you're talking mid 19 early 1960s. He said, I can't say we're running the country, but we're like the major influence on events. You're given that you're paying off journalists, you're you're heavily infiltrating often leftist movements. So when you get into this problem of why do sometimes the left movements or left parties, left politicians within, why do they betray? Why do they have like ultra left positions that favor imperialism? Sometimes it could be sincere, but sometimes it's because of the activity. They're being paid or exploited. They're poor countries. Yeah, the people have health issues they can't deal with. Then they're desperate for money. Often they're activists, but they're also desperate. They're also poor, and they can be exploited by people like AG. Like that's what AG's job was, to exploit those kind of things, to survey them, to find out what dirt there is on them that they can use against them. So it's just a great read, and he's like the first major. And he became a leftist. And what's interesting about the book, he became actually a Marxist. He went to live in Cuba. I think people know the story, right? He ended up going to Cuba. But what struck me about the book was it wasn't even, the brutality of the security forces that he was supporting. That definitely turned him. But it seems to me, in my interpretation, what turned him more is just the grinding poverty that we're doing all this shit, and it's all just about to make people suffer, to make people poor. And that's what really eventually just he couldn't take it anymore. He's like, we're doing all this stuff, and it's just to make people live in these horrible conditions. And it seems to me that that's what finally turned him. That, and also getting to know a leftist woman in Mexico who he fell in love with. But that's very interesting. So if I think it's still relevant, I think still very relevant to understanding Latin America.
Yeah, no, it's a good recommendation. I mean, I think it's known by folks, a little bit older. I think a lot of younger folks probably haven't, aren't really familiar with it. And during a important period at which, CIA whistleblowers and this kind of stuff really was a part of unraveling a lot of, we have this show Imperial 80s, where we talk about movies from the 80s. And, in the 70s and 80s, I think it's hard for people to understand when you go back and watch it. Like, there's very often the very shady CIA folks, right? Like, that are in these movies, like, because the distrust of the CIA became so significant on the heels of Philip AG, but also like there was these congressional hearings in like 75 or so, the Church Committee, all this kind of stuff. And obviously then you had Nixon, you have Watergate, you have the scandal of around, Phoenix program and also MK Ultra. And like all of this stuff kind of comes to light in this period, partly because of, activists finding stuff as well as whistleblowers and some good journalism too in the period. And nowadays, like, every show is, like, pro FBI, pro CIA, it's all, that unfortunately, I think we've lost a lot of that, critical lens around the state, unless you have the far right, talking about the deep state, but that's, like, kind of a different trajectory. And obviously on the left, I think people have these critiques, but I bet there's a lot of people that would get a lot out of reading Philip AG's book, so this is a good recommendation, I appreciate it.
Yeah, there's also, that Robert Redford's in the news because he passed away. He made this,
Yeah.
what's the name? The Name of the Condor, The Year of the Condor or something. I forget what the
Yeah, 7 Days of the Condor, or is it 3 days? No, what is it? I'll look it up. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I mentioned that because it was interesting because you mentioned about the anti-CIA or pro-CIA. That's a movie that you would have thought the CIA didn't like, but the guys who wrote National Security State Cinema, they found that actually a lot of CIA guys were actually happy with that movie. They liked being portrayed as competent villains. As long as they're being portrayed as competent and badass, they kind of like that. So it's funny because there's different flavors of propaganda that appeal to different people.
Yeah, 3 Days of the Condor is the name of the film. It's a very good movie, actually, but yeah, I could that is we just did Platoon this week, and we kinda came away from it of the same thing of, like, some people call this, like, sort of an anti-war movie. It's really not. Like, the Pentagon didn't like it, or, before it came out, but that was because like, people were doing drugs in it and stuff like that, but, ultimately, you don't come away from that movie and with a good critique of U.S.
Right.
imperialism or the war in Vietnam. Like it's not a solid critique. It actually probably makes people think, oh, these soldiers are pretty badass. So yeah. All right, Joe. Well, thank you, man. It's been really good to talk to you and to have this conversation. I'm glad we got to it, and look forward to sharing it with folks. It's good to be with you.
All right, buddy. Take care. Have a good one.
All right, you too.
Bye.